Sego seba gwego, jikoni ko haiskoni yongyatsta, no de wasa asuna de wako saliyago, wagenyato, tanosudino to wani haga ni wuko funjodo. Hello everyone, my name is Chezney Martin, and I am one of the cultural interpreters at the Woodland Cultural Center. So today I was asked to speak about the importance and significance of corn within the Haudenosaunee people. So that's going to take us back all the way to our creation story. So within our creation story, the world originated because of a woman. So this woman in our stories was called Sky Woman, and this is because she fell from the sky. So our people recognize supernaturality within our history and within the creation of man. So in our story, it's almost like there's two different planes. There's the earth, in which she fell to, and then the sky world, which she fell from. So within the story, it just kind of explains her giving birth to a daughter, and her daughter she gave birth to twins later on, and these twins caused her to pass away. So when these twins passed away, the grandmother buried her body, and from her body sprang forth our three sisters. So corn is actually one of the three sisters. That's corn, beans, and squash. And these three make up a triad that perfectly balanced our diet. It perfectly balanced our nutrient intake, and it perfectly balanced even within the soil that it was grown in. So these were almost like a symbiotic plants, and it's beautiful in the sense that they were able to grow together and help one another. So for the most part, one of the main staples that came from corn is light corn. So light corn comes from white corn. So white corn right here, this is a really, really old cob of corn. White corn is actually considered to be very high in calcium content. That's what makes it white. So if you look at the diet in itself, a lot of indigenous people are lactose intolerant. This is because milk was a staple of the European diet, but it wasn't a staple of the indigenous diet. So to replace that calcium came the white corn. The next corn that we have is more of a ceremonial corn. So this is our flint corn. So our flint corn is mainly used in our mushes. So our mushes today are kind of, they're a bit different. Like today we use pork meat. Sometimes they use beef. I've only heard of different reserves using beef, but ours, like Six Nations, uses pork. And back in the day when they made this mush for our ceremonies, it was actually robin breast meat that they would use. So these staples have been there since the beginning. Just like I said, it came from our creation. So when you look at it like that, it's something that's been with us for such a long time that it's just like bread to our European friends. So if you look at it as well, we also had a process of boiling the white corn in ash. And when we did this, it forced the corn to become light. So it's almost like a popcorn look to it. It looks like a piece of popcorn, but the texture isn't like popcorn. It's almost like a thing of its own. But once you do this to corn, it actually causes its acidity level to become alkaline. And when something is alkaline, and when your body becomes alkaline, you're very less likely to be subject to cancer throughout your life. So if you look at it like that, it's a very beautiful thing as well in the way that we cooked it, because everything was just kind of made specifically for us. And this had to do with the way that the women would germinate the seeds. So the way that you would germinate a seed is you would put the seed in your mouth and allow it to germinate almost overnight or however long it needed to. And when it germinated, you would sing seed songs, and these seed songs are still in our community. They're still passed down from generation to generation. And on top of the fact that majority of our agricultural work was done by women. So it's a very eye-opening thing to realize how old corn is. Okay, so because of those stories that explain that corn comes from Sky Woman, this makes the plant very feminine. It makes it its own entity, if that makes sense. And it's very nice to be able to call them the three sisters in the sense that a lot of Haudenosaunee women were the ones that did all of the agricultural work, all of the horticultural work as well. So understanding that, the different roles of men and women were very split. So when you look at that, majority of men, literally all they had to do was protect the people, build housing, and hunt or fish. That's the main thing that they had to do. But the other thing that they had to do as well was they had to take care of ceremony. and they had to take care of our speeches, and they had to take care of a lot of our oral history. So the women were kind of left with all of the other stuff. So that included like housework, that included all of the economic stuff. So that included like making earrings, making pottery, making everything, beadwork, blankets, clothing. All of that stuff fell with women, and it also included the responsibility of being able to grow something. And this has to do with women being able to give life. So women were considered to be almost supernatural. So our spirits are our spirits and our bodies are there to be able to facilitate life. So that included planting, because when you plant something, you give the seed life, if that makes sense. And as you go into like understanding the harmonification of those three plants, corn belongs to the grass family. Its shallow, fibrous root system requires extra nitrogen. And when you grow that with beans, they have a deep taproot and a symbiotic relationship with soil bacteria that accumulates nitrogen. So squash grow well in the shade of the beans, which climb up the corn stalks. So they all kind of work together in that way when you grow them in the soil. And if you look at a lot of our depictions, when you look at the way that we drew things, they would always draw a mound. And this mound, a lot of people would call the sky dome, but I've been told as well that it also represents the mounds that the women would grow the plants in. So when you plant a seed, you would make a mound first, and this mound would actually kind of almost facilitate a perfect little, I don't want to say womb, but it was almost like a perfect little incubator for that seed. So when they draw that, a lot of times they'll draw that mound, and they'll have like a corn stalk growing out of it in our artwork. And that's where that comes from, is how the women would kind of offer those seeds life. So it was just a very, very different way of looking at things. They looked at things as having their own personification. They looked at plants and foods as being things that they were to share as well. So one of the main things that these women would do when they grew that corn was they would grow huge fields of corn. And this is because they were told that they had to grow 3 times the amount that they needed. And this is because there was always the possibility that someone that was hungry would come by and take some. There was always a possibility of animals coming by and taking some as well. And that concept that they needed to share, that they needed to be able to give it to someone else, provided them the platform to grow those huge rows of corn. Now, if you look at a lot of the Jesuit missionaries, when they wrote in their journals, a lot of their journal entries would actually contain that disbelief at how huge the cornfields were. And when you look at it like that, they were very immense just based off of that. And just to think of how many women were out there harvesting and cultivating those fields was amazing. As you go into learning more about the history of corn as well, corn began as a very small grain. It began as a very tiny little thing that southern indigenous nations, they just selectively grew to make them bigger, to make them a source of sustenance, a source of sugar, a source of everything. So if you look at anything today, corn syrup is used in pretty much everything as a sweetener. If you look at it, it's not just cane sugar; it's mainly syrup from the corn, and that has to do with the way that it was bred as well. So it was also bred as a carbohydrate rather than just not just a carbohydrate, but a sugar and a starch, all wrapped in one. Now, as you move into learning more about it, there are also ceremonies that honor the corn as well. So there's big corn and there's little big corn. So these two different ceremonies kind of offer. They dance, they feast, and they make a certain type of soup to honor the corn. So again, they look at it as its own entity. So there's even a dance called squash dance that's performed, and the squash dance kind of imitates the people move like the squash vines, if that makes sense, when they dance. So that's a beautiful thing as well. Now, for the most part, the origin of corn came from the south. So within our depictions and our hieroglyphs, we do have panthers. We have different depictions of parrots as well. And we wouldn't have those hieroglyphs if we didn't travel to the south or travel from the south. So within our stories, we were told that we came from the south. So a lot of the Aztec and a lot of the Mexican staples of corn and the way that they made corn was actually shared with us as well. Okay, so a lot of the depictions of corn they were always paired with that mound, which is something that I explained before, the growing of the corn, which came from the mound, or the sky dome. And corn was still considered to be something of beauty. It was something that the women would cook constantly as well because it was that big of a staple. So there were so many different ways to cook it and so many different ways to make something new out of it. But one of the main effects of colonization was actually upon our diet. So we lost tons and tons of history of how we would cook things and how we would make different things and make things new. One of the newer recipes that I learned that you could make with white light corn is actually a dessert. So you just take fresh berries, like we had blueberries, we had wild grapes, we had strawberries. Strawberries were mainly cultivated as well because strawberries are a sacred food to us. And you just mix them with the light corn, you put maple syrup on top of it because our indigenous nations had maple syrup as well. So our diets were so different back then in comparison to today. And if you look at some of the Jesuit journal entries again, they always talked about how beautiful our people were. And it wasn't that we were physically beautiful, I don't think. It really had to do with how healthy we were. And it was because our diets were not ever interfered with. So our bodies over time really adapted and really climatized to having corn as a staple and having different foods as staples. So we really were very healthy. There are also stories from our elders that talk about how we didn't have any disease. We really didn't, just because our bodies were eating exactly what they should have been eating, and we were just always taking care of ourselves. And that was one way that we did it, was through our diet. Now there is a story as well that came to me not too long ago. There's a fungus that will grow on the corn, usually in splits like this. I don't remember what it's called. It's a type of fungus. And when our European settlers came and we showed them how to cultivate corn, they would grow corn and it would grow this fungus. And they were just like, nope, we can't eat it. It's ruined. We have to throw it away. But our people actually ate that fungus because it was actually, there are antimicrobial and antibacterial properties to it. So they would take that fungus and eat it because it would make sure that their insides it was basically like eating the cultures of yogurt, if that makes sense. So it would balance the cultures in their body. And that was something that I thought was just amazing. So rather than looking at the crop as destroyed when this fungus grew, they ate it. They recognized it as something that was supposed to be there, if that makes sense. So it was almost like corn just constantly gave gifts. And that's a really beautiful way to look at it. But that's exactly how our ancestors looked at it. And again, like that fungus offered antibiotic help and also antimicrobial help, which is amazing to think about. So going back to our different diets, our tons of ancestral recipes were eradicated through colonization. So that includes like the uses of spices, the uses of different everything to add to it. So if you look at corn soup, someone told me that a long time ago they used to have a certain type of onion that they would put in corn soup to make the broth taste really, really good. And they don't know what it is. They don't know what kind of bulb it was. They knew that it was a bulb, but they don't know where it is or what kind it is now because it's just gone, because the European influence upon our people really affected our diets. And a lot of indigenous people today are still lactose intolerant, but a lot of them as well are trying to adapt to this newer diet that is high in white bread and sugar, and we didn't have that. So a lot of our people are actually subject to cancer and diabetes because of this, because we're just not made for it. So I hope this really gives like a good depiction of how important corn was to our people and how much of a staple it is. To us, it's its own entity. It's one of the three sisters, so that gives its personification. It's its own person. That's how much we respected and highly regarded corn. And just really understanding that, I hope that you can come away from this really understanding that when you make a corn cob for your keychain, that there's tons and tons of history attached to that keychain. So this is what you guys are going to be making. And just to offer my last little piece of information, this is actually what would be called Indian corn. So Indian corn is actually a strain of corn, which is what I said, that a lot of different people had different strains. And this corn is actually very beautifully colored. It's not cotton candy colored, but there's so many different colors to it because there's so many different nutrients in that corn. And it's called Indian corn just because it was an Indian strain, I guess. So I hope you guys have a lot of fun making that. And I hope you come away from this really understanding how important corn was to the Haudenosaunee. Yeah.